The sound started with a silver spoon tapping against crystal. One sharp tap, then another. Nobody at the table stopped talking, but everyone heard it. The dining room at the Hawthorne Dominion Club wasn't the kind of place where people raised their voices. Deals worth 8 figures were usually discussed with a smile and a lowered tone. Tonight was no different. I sat near the end of the table in a navy blue dress I had bought 3 years earlier because it traveled well and didn't wrinkle. My father, Arthur Prescott, sat at the center like a king holding court. Beside him was my younger brother Julian, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Across from them sat 3 European defense contractors and 2 executives from a firm called Vossen Strategic Holdings. The dinner wasn't technically about defense, it was about money. Julian wanted to land a wealth management contract reportedly worth $187 million in managed assets, and Dad had spent the last 6 weeks arranging introductions through every golf partner, donor, and retired executive he knew in Washington. The wine glasses sparkled, the conversation flowed, and I quietly ate my salmon. One contractor named Henrik Bauer was explaining transportation bottlenecks affecting military suppliers moving equipment through Eastern Europe. He spoke confidently, and with enough authority that most people at the table accepted every word. Julian certainly did. Exactly, Julian said. That's why logistics is really the hidden battlefield. I almost smiled. People who actually worked in logistics rarely called it that, Henrik continued. The biggest issue remains movement through Lithuania into southern Romania. Most shipments follow that corridor. I looked up from my plate. That wasn't correct, not even close. The primary routes had shifted months earlier after infrastructure adjustments and capacity restrictions. Anyone actively involved with NATO supply coordination knew that. Julian nodded as if he had personally designed the route himself. Dad looked impressed. I waited a few seconds. Then I spoke. Most of that traffic moved west after the capacity review. Southern Romania isn't carrying the volume it used to. My voice wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, it was simply accurate. Henrik blinked. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. You believe so? He asked. I know so. The table grew quieter. I took a sip of water. The majority of the redirected movement is going through alternate channels. Romania is still important, but not in the way you're describing. Henrik frowned slightly. One of the executives beside him slowly nodded. I recognized the expression immediately, the expression of someone realizing a mistake. Then Julian laughed. Not a big laugh, just enough. You've got to appreciate my sister, he said. She reads one article, and suddenly she's briefing NATO. A few people chuckled politely. I didn't. The executive who had nodded looked between us as if he wasn't sure whether Julian was joking. Unfortunately, he wasn't. Dad pinched the bridge of his nose. I knew that gesture. I'd seen it since I was 12. It was the gesture he used whenever he felt I was making life difficult. He exhaled. Then he delivered the line that froze the entire table. Please, Gwendolyn. He shook his head. You're just a local officer. Let the international experts speak. Silence. Real silence, not the comfortable kind. Not the kind filled with background music and clinking glasses. The uncomfortable kind where people suddenly become very interested in their napkins. June smirked. Just slightly. My mother lowered her eyes toward her plate. Henrik stared into his wine glass. Nobody corrected Dad. Nobody asked what kind of officer I was. Nobody asked how I knew the information. I picked up my water, took a slow sip, and said nothing. Sometimes silence costs less. Dad immediately returned to the conversation, as if nothing had happened. Julian followed his lead. Within seconds, they were discussing international investment vehicles, offshore structures, and tax-efficient trust arrangements. The strange thing wasn't that Dad underestimated me. That part wasn't new. The strange thing was that he still did it after nearly 20 years. Most people eventually become curious. Dad never did. If information didn't come with a profit margin attached to it, he rarely looked twice. Julian inherited that quality. Actually, he improved it. Julian could estimate a stranger's net worth faster than most people could remember their names. I once watched him spend 20 minutes talking to a billionaire at a charity event, and 5 seconds talking to the waiter carrying his drink. The waiter was probably more interesting. A server appeared beside me and quietly refreshed my water. I thanked him. He thanked me for thanking him. That exchange lasted longer than my father's acknowledgement of my career over the previous year. Life has a sense of humor. Henrik eventually circled back to logistics. This time he was more careful. I noticed he avoided looking directly at me, not because he disliked me, because he wasn't sure what to make of me anymore. Dad had framed me as irrelevant, the facts suggested otherwise. That made people uncomfortable. The conversation shifted toward security cooperation in Europe, defense budgets, and emerging markets. Julian became more animated with every topic. He sprinkled military terminology into his sentences, the way people sprinkle salt on food they haven't tasted. Confident, generous, completely unnecessary. I focused on my meal. The salmon was overcooked. The asparagus was excellent. The room remained elegant. The insult remained sitting in the empty chair beside me. Have you ever known something everyone else in the room missed, yet still been treated like the least qualified person there? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, respect, and the moment truth finally walks into the room, remember our exclusive stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us for both, and make this channel part of your daily routine. A waiter removed the dessert plates just as Julian leaned forward, ready to impress the room even more. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced around the table, and launched into another explanation of global security trends as if he personally briefed heads of state every morning. Nobody stopped him. That was one of Julian's gifts. He could sound knowledgeable for surprisingly long stretches of time. Risk isn't just financial anymore, he said. The smartest investors understand geopolitical exposure. One of the contractors nodded. Another checked his phone under the table. I focused on the ice slowly melting in my water glass. Over the years, I had learned something useful. People often tell you exactly who they are if you stay quiet long enough. My father and brother certainly had. For as long as I could remember, they measured people using the same formula: income, status, visibility. If your name appeared in business magazines, you mattered. If people competed for your attention, you mattered. If you managed large sums of money, owned expensive property, or received invitations to exclusive events, you mattered. Everything else occupied a lower shelf, including me. The funny part was that I technically outranked every military officer my father had ever met socially. He just didn't know it. And because of the nature of my work, I couldn't tell him. Most of my career existed behind closed doors, encrypted systems, classified briefings, and documents that carried enough restrictions to end careers if mishandled. When family members asked what I did, I usually gave the simplest version: logistics, coordination, planning, nothing exciting. That answer had become a prison of my own making. A few years earlier, my mother had called me during Thanksgiving preparations. I still remembered the conversation. "Gwen, honey, your brother was featured in Capital Executive Monthly. That's nice. They said he's one of the most influential young wealth managers in the country. I'm happy for him." There was a pause. Then she asked the question, "And what exactly are you working on these days?" I had been sitting inside a secure operations facility reviewing emergency transportation contingencies affecting 3 allied countries. I looked at the classified folder in front of me. Then I looked at my phone. Mostly paperwork. My mother sounded disappointed. Well, steady works is still something. Steady work. That became the family description of my career, not service. Not leadership, not responsibility. Steady work. Like I spent my days alphabetizing folders in a basement. I didn't blame my mother entirely. She only knew what she was allowed to know. The real problem was that my father preferred the simpler version anyway. The truth required curiosity. The simpler version required nothing. Julian loved it even more. For years, he treated my job like a cautionary tale. Whenever he talked about ambition, he used corporate success as the benchmark. Whenever he discussed achievement, he pointed toward business leaders. Whenever he talked about me, there was always a subtle undertone: good person, hard worker, limited potential. I once attended one of his networking events in Georgetown because my mother begged me to support him. A hedge fund executive asked where I worked. Before I could answer, Julian jumped in. "My sister works on a military base." The executive smiled politely. "Oh? What does she do?" Julian shrugged. Administrative stuff. At the time, I had responsibility for coordinating operational support involving personnel spread across multiple countries. But sure, administrative stuff. I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because correcting him would have required a 30-minute security review and several signed documents. The easier choice was silence. People mistake silence for agreement all the time. They're usually wrong. Back at the dinner table, Julian continued discussing international influence. He loved that word. Influence. The ability to get calls returned, the ability to secure meetings, the ability to move money. Those things mattered. They absolutely did. But there was always something missing from his definition. Responsibility. Influence feels different when mistakes can cost lives instead of commissions. I knew the difference. A few months earlier, I had spent 31 consecutive hours inside a coordination center during a developing crisis overseas. At one point, I drank coffee that tasted like burned cardboard and ate half of a stale protein bar because nobody had time for lunch. The final transportation package involved dozens of moving parts: aircraft, fuel allocations, medical contingencies, cargo sequencing, personnel movement. Every decision affected another decision. When it finally ended, I drove home exhausted enough to forget where I had parked my own vehicle. The next morning, my father called. His first question wasn't whether I was okay. It wasn't how work was going. It wasn't whether I needed rest. He wanted to know if I had seen an interview Julian had given on financial television. I watched the segment later. Julian spent 8 minutes discussing wealth preservation strategies. Dad sent the link to everyone. Nobody asked about the operation. Nobody even knew it existed. That wasn't entirely their fault. But after enough years, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. You stop feeling angry. You start feeling distant. Across the table, Henrik asked Julian another question. Julian immediately sat up straighter. My father smiled with obvious pride. The reaction was automatic, like muscle memory. I watched them and realized something. Neither of them had ever intentionally tried to understand my world. They had simply decided what my world was. And once people become attached to a convenient story, facts rarely help. The contractor beside Henrik reached for his wine glass. Military logistics must be incredibly complex these days, he said casually. His content wasn't directed at anyone in particular. But I noticed Julian answer before I could. Oh, absolutely. I lowered my eyes toward the tablecloth. Then I took another sip of water and listened. Because when someone is convinced they understand everything, they usually keep talking long enough to prove they don't. Julian didn't disappoint. He leaned back in his chair and rotated his wine glass slowly, giving himself a second before answering the contractor's question. It was a move he used often. He thought it made him look thoughtful. Mostly it just made people wait longer. Military logistics is really about strategic force projection, he said. You have to understand operational readiness, geopolitical positioning, interoperability frameworks. He kept going. The word sounded impressive. The order didn't. Henrik nodded politely. The executive from Vossen Strategic Holdings glanced toward another guest before returning his attention to Julian. I recognized that look too. The look people give when they're trying to determine whether someone is knowledgeable or simply enthusiastic, Julian continued. The challenge today is creating synergy between security assets and logistical infrastructure. There it was, synergy. A word that usually appears when someone runs out of actual information. I lowered my eyes to my water glass. Military officers have their own version of corporate jargon. We're not innocent. But when military people misuse terminology, someone usually corrects them quickly because mistakes have consequences. In Julian's world, confidence often traveled farther than accuracy. Dad loved every second of it. Arthur Prescott sat proudly at the center of the table, occasionally adding comments about leadership and vision. The two of them operated like a traveling show. Julian sold the future. Dad sold Julian. The European guests remained courteous. Nobody challenged him directly. After all, they were there for business, not education. One of the delegates, a Belgian executive named Marc Delacroix, set down his fork and joined the conversation. I heard tonight may become even more interesting, he said. Julian immediately turned toward him. Oh, Marc smiled. There is a rumor that General Thaddeus Sterling may attend the upper reception later. The table reacted instantly. Even the people pretending not to listen started listening. General Thaddeus Sterling wasn't just another military officer. He was the NATO Supreme Commander, one of the most powerful military leaders in the world. People in my profession knew his schedule because it affected operations. People in Julian's profession knew his name because powerful people attract attention. Dad raised his eyebrows. Really? So I've heard, Mark said, nothing confirmed. Julian sat up straighter. I almost laughed, not because the situation was funny, because I knew exactly what was happening inside his head. Networking opportunity, potential client, prestige, photograph, LinkedIn post, maybe all four. You know, Julian said casually, I've actually been looking for an opportunity to meet General Sterling. Of course he had. Mark looked interested. Oh? My firm has developed several unique international portfolio structures that might appeal to someone operating at that level. I nearly choked on my water. Operating at that level. General Sterling commanded military coordination involving multiple nations. Julian wanted to discuss wealth management products. The contrast was impressive. Dad nodded approvingly. Julian has always been excellent at building relationships. That statement was technically true. Julian could build relationships with almost anyone who improved his position. The rest rarely received follow-up calls. One of the contractors asked, You believe the general would be interested? Julian smiled confidently. Every successful person thinks about legacies. There was a brief silence. Then Henrik slowly nodded. I couldn't tell whether he agreed or simply wanted to keep the conversation moving. Julian mistook silence for encouragement. A common mistake. He launched into another explanation of leadership, influence, and strategic networking. The more he spoke, the larger the version of himself became inside his own story. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward military command structures. That was unfortunate. Because military command structures happened to be one of the subjects Julian understood least. Generals spend most of their time handling diplomatic relationships now, he announced. I kept my face neutral. Not entirely. One corner of my mouth moved, just enough. Julian noticed. His eyes shifted toward me. There it was, the look. The one he always used when he wanted an audience. Gwen. The table turned toward me. I met his gaze. Yeah? He smiled, not warmly. The way a magician smiles before performing a trick. You've worked around military people for years. Worked around, interesting choice. Sure. Have you ever actually seen a general in person? A few guests chuckled softly. Julian leaned farther back, enjoying himself. Not on television, he added. I mean in real life. Dad smiled into his wine glass. My mother immediately looked uncomfortable. She knew where this was going. She always knew. She just never stopped it. I considered several possible answers, the truthful answer, the diplomatic answer, the entertaining answer. Instead, I chose the safest one. A few times. Julian laughed. A few times? Sure, he shook his head. That's probably exciting. The contractor beside him smiled awkwardly. Even he seemed uncertain now. I took another sip of water. It depends on the meeting. That answer was technically accurate. Some meetings involved generals. Some involved ministers. Some involved people whose names never appeared anywhere public. Most meetings involved coffee that tasted terrible. Julian interpreted my calmness as surrender. Another common mistake. Well, he said, if General Sterling shows up tonight, maybe you'll finally get to see what the top level looks like. The smile remained on his face. Dad chuckled. Mark stared at his plate. Henrik suddenly became fascinated by the wine list. Nobody wanted to participate. Nobody wanted to intervene. And nobody understood how absurd the conversation actually was. I wasn't offended anymore, not really. The emotion had changed over the years. When I was younger, comments like that bothered me. By 39, they mostly felt predictable, like hearing the same joke repeated every Thanksgiving. The only difference was the audience. Julian believed influence was something you displayed. A title on a business card, a seat at the right table, an introduction to the right person. He genuinely believed that, which was why he never noticed the flaw. The people with the most responsibility rarely spent much time talking about how important they were. Across the room, a club employee quietly opened one of the side doors and spoke to a manager. The manager immediately straightened his jacket. A second employee appeared moments later, then a third. Small changes, easy to miss, I noticed them anyway. Years of operational work teach you to pay attention when routines suddenly change, especially in rooms filled with powerful people. Julian was too busy planning his future conversation with General Sterling to notice any of it. And, judging by the growing activity around the dining hall, that conversation might arrive sooner than he expected. The first sign wasn't dramatic. Nobody announced anything. No alarms sounded. No one walked in carrying important-looking folders. A manager simply appeared near the entrance and stopped smiling. That got my attention. People who work in elite private clubs are trained to smile through almost everything. Delayed reservations, difficult guests, million-dollar arguments disguised as polite conversation. They smile through all of it. When they suddenly stop smiling, something has changed. A second manager emerged from a side corridor. Then another. The club staff began moving differently, faster, more carefully. A server collecting empty glasses altered his route halfway through the room after receiving a subtle hand signal. Two employees quietly closed access to a hallway that had been open all evening. Nobody at our table noticed. Julian was still talking. Because global leadership ultimately comes down to relationships. Of course it did. Everything came down to relationships when you sold wealth management. Across the dining hall, two men entered through a service entrance. Dark suits, clear earpieces, professional posture. They didn't look like club members. They looked like security, real security. The kind that doesn't need to tell you they're security. One positioned himself near a doorway. The other remained stationary for a few seconds, studying the room, not casually, methodically. My attention sharpened immediately. Years of military work create habits that never fully disappear. You learn to notice movement. You learn to notice patterns. You learn to notice when someone is pretending not to observe while actually observing everything. The room was changing. Most people were still eating dessert. Most people were still talking. But the atmosphere felt different, like a meeting that had quietly shifted topics before half the participants realized it. Henrik finally noticed one of the men. He glanced toward the entrance, then toward another corner of the room. His conversation slowed, not stopped, slowed. The security presence continued growing. 3 more men appeared, then 2 women. Each positioned themselves naturally enough to avoid attention. Each maintained clear sight lines. Each communicated without speaking. Professional, disciplined. I recognized the system immediately. Julian didn't. That's why our firm has expanded aggressively into European markets, he continued. Nobody interrupted him, partly because they were polite, partly because they were starting to look past him. Dad adjusted his tie. He noticed the additional activity. Unfortunately, he reached the wrong conclusion. His eyes brightened. I knew that look. Opportunity, networking, status. Arthur Prescott could smell social advancement from across a room. Something important must be happening upstairs, he said. Julian followed his gaze. His expression changed instantly. There he is. There wasn't actually a general present yet, just security. But in Julian's mind, security and opportunity had already merged into one thing. He straightened his jacket, checked his cufflinks, adjusted his posture. The transformation was almost impressive. A moment earlier, he had been selling financial products. Now he was preparing for what he imagined would become a historic introduction. My mother quietly reached for her water. I noticed she seemed uncomfortable again. Beatrice had spent decades navigating the space between my father and the rest of reality. It wasn't an easy position. Whenever conflict approached, her instinct was always the same. Make things smooth. Keep people comfortable. Avoid embarrassment. Unfortunately, some embarrassments arrive whether you invite them or not. Another security officer entered. This one paused near our section of the room. His eyes moved across several tables, then landed on me for less than a second. Nothing unusual to an outsider, everything unusual to me. Recognition, professional recognition. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge me openly. He simply gave the smallest nod imaginable, then continued scanning. I returned my attention to my water glass. The exchange lasted perhaps half a second. Nobody noticed. At least I thought nobody noticed. A moment later, another member of the security detail passed nearby. Same thing, brief eye contact. Tiny nod, move on. The language was familiar, not friendship, not admiration, professional respect. The kind exchanged between people who understand the rules of the room. Across the table, Julian remained completely unaware. He was busy rehearsing future success. I think introductions matter, he told Mark. If General Sterling is here, I should at least say hello. Mark offered a cautious smile. You may find him busy, Julian laughed. Everyone's busy. Not everyone. Some people are responsible. There is a difference. Dad chuckled approvingly. That's the confidence that built your business. Julian accepted the compliment without hesitation. The room continued shifting around them. Security personnel now occupied nearly every major access point. Conversations across the dining hall became quieter. Guests started glancing toward entrances. Even people who knew nothing about military protocol understood something significant was approaching. One officer near the far wall turned slightly toward me. Another brief acknowledgement. Nothing more. The pattern continued. Invisible to everyone else. Obvious to me. The strange part wasn't the recognition. The strange part was watching it happen while my own family sat 3 feet away believing I was the least important person at the table. Dad still thought I handled paperwork. Julian still thought I spent my days processing forms. Neither one noticed trained federal security personnel quietly identifying me before identifying anyone else in the room. Life has a peculiar sense of timing. Henrik finally stopped pretending not to watch the activity. Security seems extensive. That's a good sign, Julian replied immediately. He sounded excited. Like someone discussing front row concert tickets, not the arrival of one of the most senior military leaders on the planet. My father nodded. The important people are arriving. I almost smiled. Important people. That phrase again. It followed our family everywhere. Important people, successful people, influential people. As if human value could be measured by introductions and photographs. The security officer nearest the entrance suddenly touched his earpiece. Every member of the detail reacted, not dramatically, professionally, tiny adjustments. Slight posture changes, immediate awareness. The system had received new information. The room grew noticeably quieter. Julian leaned forward. Dad straightened his shoulders. Several guests turned toward the main entrance. My mother slowly set down her glass. And while everyone else focused on the doors, I noticed something they didn't. Every member of the security detail already knew exactly where I was sitting. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the dining hall opened. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to plates. Several guests instinctively stood straighter. No announcement was made. None was necessary. General Thaddeus Sterling entered the room surrounded by aides and security personnel. He wasn't physically imposing in the way movies often portray military leaders. He wasn't towering over everyone. He wasn't performing authority. He simply carried it. People moved differently around him. That was usually the giveaway. The general walked at a steady pace, exchanging brief greetings with club officials near the entrance. 2 aides followed several steps behind carrying tablets and folders. A security officer remained slightly ahead of the group, quietly monitoring the room. Nobody rushed him, nobody and out of him. Most people understood the difference between opportunity and foolishness. Most people. Julian's eyes practically lit up. There he is. Dad immediately adjusted his tie again. For the 3rd time in 10 minutes, my mother closed her eyes briefly. Not long, just long enough for me to notice. She knew exactly what Julian was thinking. Unfortunately, knowing never stopped him. Marc Delacroix slowly set down his glass. Henrik shifted in his chair. The executives from Vossen Strategic Holdings watched with professional curiosity. Julian was already calculating angles. I could almost see it happening. Distance. Timing. Approach path. Opening line. Expected outcome. The problem wasn't confidence. Confidence can be useful. The problem was that Julian always assumed every room operated by the same rules. He believed access was simply a matter of persistence. A bigger personality. A better pitch. A stronger handshake. Military leadership doesn't work that way. Neither does responsibility. General Sterling continued moving through the reception area. Several guests greeted him briefly. A few received polite responses. Others received simple nods. The flow remained controlled, predictable, professional. Then Julian pushed his chair back. I heard it scrape softly across the floor. Dad smiled immediately. The proud parent smile. The one reserved for moments when he believed his son was about to impress the world. There you go, Dad said quietly. Julian stood, straightened his jacket, picked up a glossy business card from the table. The cardstock alone probably cost more than most people spend printing an entire box. He started walking. My mother opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. Nobody stopped him. I didn't either. Sometimes people need room to make their own decisions, even bad ones. Julian moved confidently through the dining hall. The security detail noticed him immediately. Of course they did. They noticed everything. But he wasn't behaving aggressively. He wasn't creating a threat. He was simply another ambitious man trying to get close to someone important. Washington produces thousands of those every year. General Sterling approached a junction between the dining room and the reception corridor. That was where Julian intercepted him. Directly, right in front of him. I heard Henrik inhale sharply. Mark looked away. The security officers reacted instantly but professionally. One moved half a step closer, another adjusted position. No confrontation, just readiness. Julian extended his hand and his business card, General Sterling. His voice carried farther than he probably intended. My name is Julian Prescott. The general stopped. Not because he wanted to, because a human being had stepped directly into his path. Julian smiled confidently. I manage international wealth portfolios through Prescott Global Asset Partners. The general said nothing. Julian continued. Of course he did. We specialize in protecting generational wealth for high-performing leaders. Still nothing. Dad watched from our table with visible pride. I could practically hear his thoughts. Look at my son. Look how fearless he is. Look how connected he is becoming. The reality looked slightly different from where I was sitting. General Sterling remained perfectly polite, but his expression hadn't changed, not even a little. Julian mistook silence for interest. Again, I'd love the opportunity to discuss some strategies that might align with your long-term objectives. One of the aides glanced at another aide. A security officer looked toward the ceiling for half a second. It was the professional equivalent of trying not to laugh. Julian pressed forward, then he made a mistake. A completely unnecessary mistake. He gestured back toward our table, toward me. My sister is in the military too. For the first time, General Sterling's eyes followed the gesture. Julian smiled, trying to build credibility, trying to create common ground, trying to use me as a prop. Just a local desk job, he added casually. Several people at nearby tables heard it, so we deeply respect the uniform. Dad nodded proudly. As if that statement represented our family perfectly, I remained seated. My hands rested calmly on the white tablecloth. I didn't move, didn't interrupt, didn't react. Years of military service teach patience. Years of family dinners teach even more. General Sterling's gaze settled briefly in my direction. Not long. Just a moment, then something changed, tiny, almost invisible. But I saw it. One of the aides noticed it too. The security officer nearest the corridor noticed it as well. Recognition, not from me, from him. Julian kept talking. He had no idea. We've always admired military leadership. Another business card appeared in his hand. Apparently he had brought backups. The general never looked at either card. Not once. Julian extended one farther forward. Still smiling. Still pitching. Still convinced the conversation was going exactly where he wanted. At our table, my father sat straighter than ever. My mother stared into her water glass. Henrik looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mark suddenly seemed fascinated by the architecture of the ceiling. The entire room was watching now. Not openly, but watching. And standing there in the center of it all, Julian continued delivering the most important sales pitch of his life to a man who wasn't listening to a single word. The business card remained extended. Julian's smile remained in place. His confidence remained untouched, for about 3 more seconds. Then General Thaddeus Sterling looked directly past him, not around him, not at the card, not at the logo printed in silver lettering, past him. The movement was subtle, but every person watching noticed it immediately. Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence. His hand was still hanging in the air. The general's eyes moved across the dining hall. One table, then another, methodical, focused, searching. The room became strangely quiet. Even the servers stopped moving. Nobody knew what was happening, except me. I had a pretty good idea. General Sterling's gaze continued across the room until it reached our table. Then it stopped. Locked. The distance between us wasn't large, maybe 40 feet, close enough. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then I gave the smallest nod, professional, respectful, nothing more. The general's posture changed instantly, not dramatically, but enough. The difference was obvious if you knew what to look for. The cold formality he had shown everyone else disappeared. Not replaced by warmth, replaced by recognition. One of the aides beside him noticed it immediately. Several members of the security detail noticed too. Julian didn't. At least not yet. General, he said, still holding the card. Still trying to recover control of the conversation. No response. The general took a step forward, past him. Julian blinked, confused. The general took another step. Still not acknowledging the card, still not acknowledging the pitch, still not acknowledging Julian at all. The realization began arriving in slow motion. You could see it happening. First confusion, then uncertainty, then embarrassment. The business card lowered slightly, not by choice, by gravity. General Sterling walked directly past him. Completely, as if my brother had never been standing there. The room watched every second. No one looked away, not even Dad. Arthur Prescott's smile vanished. Gone, just like that. He looked from Julian to the general and back again, trying to understand, trying to find an explanation. There wasn't one. Julian remained frozen near the reception corridor, hand still half raised, business card still visible, looking like a man who had shown up to the wrong meeting. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The sound of the general's boots became the loudest thing in the room, measured, steady, rhythmic. Each step crossing polished hardwood flooring that as he seemed much larger than before. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Conversations had completely died. The security detail shifted with him. Not aggressively, professionally, creating space, maintaining visibility, managing movement. The entire room followed the same path with their eyes. The general wasn't heading toward the reception area. He wasn't heading toward club leadership. He wasn't heading toward any of the defense contractors. He wasn't heading toward the wealthy donors. He was heading directly toward our table. Dad finally noticed. The color drained from his face, immediately. I had never seen that happen before, not once in my entire life. Arthur Prescott was a man who remained calm during business collapses, lawsuits, market crashes, and family arguments. Now he looked genuinely frightened. "What is happening?" he whispered. Nobody answered. My mother gripped the edge of the table, not hard, just enough. I noticed because her knuckles turned pale. Her breathing changed too, shorter, shallower. Beatrice wasn't afraid of military leaders, she was afraid of public embarrassment. And from her perspective, there was only one explanation. Julian had made a mistake. A serious one, a very public one. The general was coming to address it. Henrik looked equally concerned. Mark sat perfectly still. One of the Vossen executives quietly lowered his phone beneath the table. Nobody wanted evidence of whatever was about to happen. Dad swallowed. I actually heard it. Julian shouldn't have approached him, he said. My mother nodded immediately. Oh my God. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them considered any alternative explanation. Why would they? In their minds, I was still the least important person at the table. The local officer. The daughter with the desk job, the safe, predictable child who never became remarkable. The irony was almost funny, almost. General Sterling continued walking, 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. The security officers already positioned throughout the dining hall subtly adjusted their stance. Several glanced toward me again. Professional acknowledgement. Nothing more. Everything was unfolding exactly as expected. Just not for anyone else. Julian finally turned around. He followed the general's path. Then his eyes reached our table. I watched confusion hit him. Real confusion. Not embarrassment, not frustration, confusion. Because for the first time all evening, the situation no longer fit inside the story he had written for himself. His eyes moved across the table. Dad, Mom, Henrik, me, back to me, then back to the general. The connection still hadn't formed, not yet. The general closed the remaining distance. 5 feet, 4, 3. The entire dining hall seemed frozen. Nobody touched their food. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody spoke. General Sterling stopped directly beside our table. Dad looked like he might stand up. Mom looked like she forgot how. Julian remained halfway across the room, still holding the business card nobody wanted. And as the silence stretched across the dining hall, every member of my family prepared themselves for a reprimand that was never coming. General Sterling stopped beside my chair, close enough that I could see the faint crease near his left eye, close enough that I could see exhaustion hiding beneath decades of discipline. The room waited. My father waited. My mother waited. Julian stood frozen across the dining hall. Everyone expected the same thing, a correction, a warning, a reminder about protocol. Instead, I placed my hands on the table and stood. Slowly, deliberately, the movement alone created confusion. I heard a chair shift somewhere behind me. Someone near the reception area whispered something. Nobody understood why I was standing. General Sterling did. The moment our eyes met, the uncertainty disappeared from his face. Not because he recognized me, because he had already recognized me the second he entered the room. The security detail knew, his aides knew. Now he was simply confirming it. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Professional courtesy. Nothing more. Then General Thaddeus Sterling snapped his heels together. The sound echoed sharply through the dining hall. Every dead turned, every conversation died completely. And before anyone could process what was happening, the NATO Supreme Commander delivered a perfect salute. Not casual, not symbolic, perfect. The kind of salute military personnel spend years learning. the kind given when respect is non-negotiable. A collective gasp moved through the room. My father's eyes widened. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Julian stopped breathing. At least it looked that way from where I stood. I returned the salute immediately. Natural. Automatic. Years of training reduced certain actions to instinct. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. But for my family, it might as well have lasted an hour, because nothing they believed about me fit what they were seeing. The general lowered his hand. I lowered mine. And then something happened that I had never expected. Not because it was impossible, because it was unnecessary. General Sterling lowered his head, not slightly, not politely, deeply. A profound bow of respect. The entire room froze. Several people actually stood up from their chairs. One of the contractors dropped his fork. It struck the plate with a sharp metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud. My father stared at the general as if reality itself had malfunctioned. I understood his reaction. Military protocol doesn't work this way. Not normally. A commander of General Sterling's position did not bow to colonels. Not publicly. Not privately. Not ever. Which was exactly why everyone understood the significance immediately. This wasn't protocol. This was gratitude. When the general finally spoke, his voice carried effortlessly through the room, not because he raised it. Because nobody else dared make a sound. Colonel Prescott. Every person in the dining hall heard the title, Colonel. Not officer, not administrator, not local employee, Colonel. The word landed like a hammer. I saw my father's jaw twitch. I saw Julian's expression collapse. The general continued. The men of the 82nd Airborne, and my own son, are alive today because of your logistical extraction in the Baltics. Nobody moved, nobody even blinked. The Baltic operation. I hadn't spoken about it in years. Most people couldn't. Most details remained classified. The public version never captured what actually happened. A deteriorating security situation. Multiple transport failures. Fuel shortages. Weather complications. Damaged infrastructure. Personnel trapped in locations that were becoming increasingly unsafe. The operation had required thousands of decisions. Most of them made under extraordinary pressure. The kind of pressure nobody writes articles about. The kind that leaves people staring at ceilings at 3 a.m, months later. General Sterling looked directly at me. I was told you were here. His voice softened slightly. I came to pay my debts. The room simply stopped functioning. That was the only way to describe it. Every assumption, every conclusion, every label attached to my name over the years shattered at the same time. The daughter who handled paperwork. The daughter with the desk job. The daughter who lacked ambition. Gone. Arthur Prescott looked physically unsteady. His face had lost all color. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. Not disagreement, not disappointment. Confusion. Because he suddenly realized there were entire parts of my life he had never even attempted to understand. My mother looked like she wanted to cry. Not dramatically, quietly, the way people do when a truth arrives years later than it should have. Across the room, Julian looked sick. Actually sick. His shoulders had dropped. The confidence was gone. The smile was gone. Even the business card was gone. I noticed it lying on the floor beside him, abandoned, forgotten. The European contractor stared at me with open disbelief. Henrik's mouth remained slightly open. Mark Delacroix looked as though someone had just informed him that the waitress serving coffee was secretly running the Pentagon. One of the Vossen executives slowly sat back down after standing without realizing it. The entire room had spent the evening evaluating status, money, influence, prestige, connections, and suddenly the person they had ignored at the edge of the table became the center of gravity. Not because I wanted attention, not because I demanded recognition, because truth eventually arrives whether people invite it or not. General Sterling straightened. His expression remained serious, professional, respectful. The way one professional acknowledges another. Nothing theatrical, nothing exaggerated, just honest. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Because there was no performance, only reality. The silence that followed felt different from every silence earlier that evening. Before, people were waiting. Now they were understanding. And judging by the look on my father's face, understanding was proving far more painful than ignorance ever had. Nobody moved for several seconds after General Sterling finished speaking. The room seemed caught between two realities. The one people had believed an hour ago, and the one standing directly in front of them now. General Sterling extended his hand. I shook it. firmly, professionally, the way colleagues acknowledge each other after difficult work. No speeches. No dramatic gestures. No attempt to prolong the moment. That wasn't his style. It wasn't mine either. One of his aides quietly stepped forward and spoke to him. The general nodded, then looked back at me. Colonel Prescott. Sir, I appreciate everything your team did. I smiled slightly. It was a team effort. He nodded once. The answer seemed to satisfy him, because people who carry real responsibility understand something important. No major success belongs to one person, not in military operations, not in life. General Sterling offered a final handshake, then turned and walked away. His security detail moved with him. The aides followed. Within moments, the center of attention disappeared from the room as efficiently as it had arrived. But the damage remained. The room slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed in scattered fragments. Chairs shifted. Glasses moved. People breathed again. Nobody at our table spoke. Not immediately. Henrik stared at me. Mark looked like he was reconsidering every conversation we'd had that evening. The executives from Vossen Strategic Holdings suddenly seemed very interested in introducing themselves properly. I couldn't blame them. 5 minutes earlier, they thought I processed paperwork. Now they knew I had coordinated operations discussed inside military headquarters. Life moves fast. Across the room, Julian finally returned to the table. His walk looked different, slower, less certain. The confidence that usually arrived before he entered a room was gone. So was the performance. He sat down without saying a word. That alone was remarkable. My father remained motionless. I had never seen him look older. Not physically, mentally. Like someone trying to reorganize decades of assumptions all at once. Eventually, he cleared his throat. Nobody responded. He tried again. Gwen. The word came out unevenly. I looked at him. For the first time all evening, he didn't seem interested in controlling the room. He seemed interested in understanding it. Unfortunately, understanding often arrives late. My father stared at the tablecloth for a moment, then looked back at me. His voice sounded smaller than usual. Gwen. Another pause. Why didn't you tell us you were this important? There it was. The question. Not what did you do? Not how many people were involved? Not was it difficult? Not are you okay after carrying responsibilities like that? Important. Even now he framed everything through importance, status, recognition, visibility, the same measuring stick, same stake. For a moment, I simply looked at him. Not angrily, not triumphantly, just honestly. The strange thing was that I wasn't hurt anymore. That part had faded years ago. Somewhere between late-night operation centers and missed holidays. Somewhere between emergency calls and classified briefings. Somewhere between learning responsibility and outgrowing the need for approval. I felt something closer to pity. Not for his embarrassment, for everything he had missed. All those years, all those opportunities, all those conversations we never had because he assumed he already knew who I was. I spoke calmly. Because, Dad, true importance doesn't need to be announced at a dinner table. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. It just does the work when people's lives depend on it. Silence followed. Real silence, not uncomfortable, not dramatic, just honest. My father lowered his eyes. For once he had no argument, no correction, no lecture, no advice, nothing. Because there was nothing left to defend. Julian stared at his folded hands. I could practically hear the questions running through his head. When did this happen? How much didn't I know? How many times did I talk down to her? The answers wouldn't be pleasant. My mother finally reached across the table and touched my hand, gently. She didn't say anything. That was probably the wisest thing anyone had done all evening. Some moments don't need explanations. I squeezed her hand once, then released it. Around us, the dining room slowly returned to normal. People resumed conversations. Servers carried fresh drinks. Business deals continued. The world kept moving. It always does. I picked up my napkin, folded it carefully, set up beside a plate. The gesture felt strangely final. Not because I planned to cut anyone out of my life. Not because I was angry. Because something had ended. The endless competition. The need to prove myself. The hope that one more accomplishment would finally earn understanding. That burden disappeared the moment General Sterling walked across the room. Not because he validated me, because he revealed something. People see only what they're willing to see. No achievement can fix that. No title can fix that. No amount of success can fix that. Only humility can. I stood. My chair slid quietly backward. Every member of my family looked up. I smiled. Small, polite, peaceful. The way someone smiles when they're finally carrying less weight than they were an hour earlier. I'm heading out. Nobody tried to stop me. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. Julian looked down again. My mother nodded. I walked towards the exit, past the tables, past the reception corridor, past the security personnel still stationed throughout the club. One of them gave a subtle nod as I passed. I returned it. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. For the first time all evening, I was completely alone, and completely at peace. Behind me, my family remained seated at that table, surrounded by expensive suits, investment portfolios, business opportunities, and every symbol of success they had spent a lifetime chasing. Yet none of those things could change the realization now sitting in front of them. They had spent years measuring wealth in dollars, influence in introductions, importance in applause, while the daughter they barely noticed had quietly spent her life helping carry responsibilities that never appeared on magazine covers. Some lessons arrive gently, others arrive all at once. That night, my family finally learned the difference, and I drove home without needing them to understand any more than they already had. The drive home that night gave me a lot of time to think. Not about my father, not about Julian, not even about General Sterling. What stayed with me was something much simpler. A question. Over the years, whenever people heard versions of stories like mine, they usually asked the same thing. Gwen, if you could go back and do it again, would you tell your family the truth sooner? It's a fair question. Most people assume the problem was secrecy. They assume everything would have been different if I had simply walked into a family dinner 10 years earlier and announced my rank, my responsibilities, or the operations I was involved in. But honestly, I don't think it would have changed much, because the problem was never information. The problem was how people chose to measure value. My father wasn't missing facts. He was using the wrong ruler. A lot of people do. In fact, I think it's one of the most expensive mistakes human beings make. Not expensive financially. Expensive person-emotionally. Expensive relationally. We look at a person and immediately start collecting evidence. What car do they drive? What neighborhood do they live in? How many followers do they have? What title is printed on their business card? How many people recognize their name? Then we make a judgment, sometimes within seconds. The strange thing is that many of the most valuable people you'll ever meet don't score particularly well on those measurements. Some of the best leaders I've ever worked with would never impress anyone at a country club dinner. One of the most respected helicopter pilots he knew drove a pickup truck with over 240,000 miles on it. The driver's side window worked when he hit the door twice. Everybody joked about it. Nobody joked about his abilities. Because when conditions became difficult, everybody wanted him in the cockpit. I worked with a logistic engineer who could coordinate transportation assets across multiple countries without raising his voice. He wore the same inexpensive watch every day for 7 years. Nobody would have looked at him and thought, "There's an exceptional person." They would have been wrong. I once met a senior commander who was responsible for thousands of personnel. He regularly arrived at meetings carrying his own coffee and often helped younger officers clean up conference rooms afterward. If you met him at a grocery store, you'd assume he was retired. Meanwhile, people with half his responsibility often behaved like celebrities. That taught me something important. There is a huge difference between being important and looking important. Looking important is often easy. The right clothes help. The right language helps. The right audience helps. Being important is harder. Being important means becoming useful, reliable, trustworthy, capable. The kind of person people can depend on when something actually matters. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The world often rewards appearances before it rewards substance. That's why so many people get confused. A flashy presentation gets attention. Quiet competence often doesn't, at least not immediately. My father spent most of his life around successful business people. Many of them were genuinely impressive. But over time, he began treating visibility and value as the same thing. They're not even close. Some people are highly visible because they create value. Others are highly visible because they attract attention. Those are very different skills. One changes lives, the other changes headlines. When I was younger, I took my family's judgment personally. I wanted them to see me differently. I wanted them to understand. I wanted them to recognize what I was contributing. That's normal. Most of us want that. We want the people closest to us to see us accurately. But eventually, I learned something that brought me a lot of peace. Not everyone who misunderstands you deserves an explanation. Some people genuinely want to know who you are. Others simply want you to fit the version they've already created in their minds. No amount of evidence changes that. No promotion changes that. No award changes that. No title changes that. Because the problem isn't information. The problem is perspective. That's why I want to leave you with a practical question. The next time you meet someone, what exactly are you evaluating? Are you looking at appearances or are you looking at character? Are you impressed by visibility or are you paying attention to usefulness? Are you measuring status? Or are you measuring integrity? Those questions matter more than most people realize. Because eventually every relationship becomes a reflection of what we choose to value. My father spent years admiring success. General Sterling spent years appreciating service. One approach builds admiration, the other builds respect. And if I've learned anything from my career, it's this. Many people spend their lives trying to become impressive. Far fewer spend their lives trying to become valuable. The second group usually leaves a bigger impact, even when nobody is watching. Far fewer spend their lives trying to become valuable. Even fewer understand what real respect actually looks like. After that dinner, I received dozens of messages. Some came from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some came from former colleagues. A few came from complete strangers who had heard pieces of the story through mutual connections. What surprised me wasn't the number of messages. It was the type of questions people asked. Most of them weren't interested in military operations. They weren't interested in NATO. They weren't interested in rank. They wanted to talk about General Sterling. Specifically, they wanted to talk about the moment he stopped and acknowledged someone else's contribution. That caught their attention. And honestly, I understand why. Because genuine respect has become surprisingly rare. A lot of people think respect means being admired. It doesn't. A lot of people think respect means having authority. It doesn't. A lot of people think respect means being the most important person in the room. It definitely doesn't. Those things can create attention. They can create influence. Sometimes they can even create fear. But they don't automatically create respect. I've worked around powerful people for most of my adult life. Military leaders, government officials, international partners, senior executives. And one thing became obvious very quickly. The people who demanded respect usually received compliance. The people who earned respect received trust. Those are not the same thing. My father spent much of his life pursuing admiration. He wanted people to be impressed. He wanted recognition. He wanted success that could be seen. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Most people enjoy being appreciated. The problem begins when admiration becomes the goal. Because admiration is often temporary. Someone richer eventually appears. Someone more successful eventually appears. Someone with a larger house, a bigger company, or a more impressive title eventually appears. The finish line keeps moving. My brother struggled with something similar. Julian wanted validation. He wanted confirmation that he was winning. Again, that's a very human desire. But it can become exhausting. Because when your self-worth depends on external recognition, you're forced to keep chasing it. The next promotion, the next client, the next achievement, the next compliment. It's like drinking salt water. No matter how much you consume, you remain thirsty. General Sterling operated differently. That's one reason people respected him. When he entered that dining room, he didn't arrive looking for admiration. He didn't arrive looking for applause. He didn't arrive looking for attention. He already had those things. What brought him into that room was gratitude. Think about that for a moment. One of the most senior military leaders in the world walked into a room full of wealthy, influential people and chose to publicly acknowledge someone else's contribution. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. That decision revealed more about his character than any speech could have. One lesson I learned early in my career is that truly confident people are not threatened by giving credit away. Insecure people protect recognition. Confident people share it. I've seen that lesson play out countless times. I once worked with a commander who spent 15 minutes during an award ceremony talking about the efforts of junior personnel. By the end of the speech, people respected him more than if he had spent the entire time discussing himself. Not because he appeared humble, because he actually was. Another leader I admired kept a notebook filled with names. Every time someone on his team solved a difficult problem, he wrote it down. Months later, he could still remember who contributed what. People would walk through walls for that man, not because they feared him, because they felt seen. That's the power of recognition. And this lesson applies far beyond military organizations. It applies inside families, inside marriages, inside friendships, inside workplaces. Some of the strongest relationships I've ever seen were built on simple appreciation, not grand gestures, not expensive gifts, not dramatic speeches, just consistent acknowledgement. A husband notices how much his wife carries. A wife recognizes the sacrifices her husband makes. A manager appreciates a reliable employee. A parent thanks a child. A friend remembers what another friend did during a difficult season. Small things, but small things accumulate. So do ignored contributions. That's where many relationships begin to crack. People often assume relationships fail because love disappears. Sometimes that's true. But many relationships suffer for a different reason. People stop feeling valued. They begin carrying responsibilities that nobody notices. They solve problems nobody acknowledges. They make sacrifices nobody recognizes. Eventually, exhaustion replaces connection. I've seen it happen in families. I've seen it happen in teams. I've seen it happen in marriages. And almost every time, the warning signs were visible long before the damage became obvious. That's why I want to challenge you with something practical. Think about the people who make your life easier. Not the most visible people, not the loudest people, the helpful people, the dependable people, the ones who quietly solve problems, the ones who keep showing up. The ones who carry responsibilities without demanding recognition. Have you thanked them recently? Have you acknowledged them? Have you made sure they know their effort matters? Because sometimes the person holding your world together is the person you're paying the least attention to. And if my family's story taught me anything, it's that appreciation becomes much more meaningful before a wake-up call than after one. So here's a question worth carrying with you today. Who in your life has been carrying more than you realize? And what would happen if you made sure they knew you noticed? That's a question I think about often. But there's another question people ask me even more frequently. What happened after that dinner? Most people expect a dramatic answer. They expect a confrontation, an apology, a family meeting, a long emotional conversations where everyone finally says exactly what they should have said years earlier. Real life usually isn't that neat. Some conversations happened, some didn't. Some relationships improved, some remained complicated. That's how families work. But the biggest change that happened after that night wasn't in my father, it wasn't in my brother, it was in me. The surprising part wasn't the recognition. The surprising part was the relief. For years, I had carried a quiet burden that I didn't fully understand. I wanted to be seen accurately. I wanted my family to understand who I really was. I wanted them to stop treating me like the least accomplished person in the room. I wanted their respect. Those desires weren't unreasonable. Most people have them. Children want approval from their parents. Siblings want to be understood. Human beings want to be recognized for who they are. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem begins when your peace becomes dependent on receiving it. That's where many people get stuck. They spend years trying to earn validation from people who have already decided not to give it. They keep bringing evidence, more achievements, more sacrifices, more accomplishments, more proof. They believe the next success will finally change everything. The next promotion, the next degree, the next award, the next milestone, the next achievement. Then one day they reach it, and nothing changes, because the issue was never their value. The issue was the audience. I learned that lesson later than I wish I had. For a long time, part of me believed that if my father truly understood my work, he would finally see me differently. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. The truth is that it stopped mattering. Not because I stopped loving my family, because I stopped needing their approval to validate my life. That distinction changed everything. One of the healthiest realizations a person can have is this. You can love people without making them the judge of your worth. Read that again. You can love people without making them the judge of your worth. A lot of people need to hear that, especially if you grew up trying to earn acceptance. Especially if you've spent years chasing validation from a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a boss, or even friends. At some point, every adult faces a choice. Do I continue building my identity around someone else's opinion, Or do I build my identity around my values? One path creates anxiety, the other creates peace. That doesn't mean criticism stops hurting. It doesn't mean rejection becomes easy. It doesn't mean we're suddenly immune to disappointment. We're human. Of course, those things affect us, but they stop controlling us. That's the difference. I've met people who spent decades trying to prove themselves to someone who was never going to be satisfied. A father, a mother, a partner, an employer. 20 years later, they're still fighting the same battle, still presenting evidence, still hoping for a verdict, still waiting for permission to feel enough. That's a terrible way to spend a life. Because while you're trying to convince one person, you're missing the life that's already in front of you. The opportunities, the relationships, the experiences, the people who already appreciate you, the people who already see your value. One thing military service taught me is that purpose and recognition are not the same thing. Some of the most meaningful work you'll ever do may never receive public recognition. Some of the most important things you'll ever contribute may never be fully understood by others. That doesn't reduce their value, not even a little. A good parent doesn't become less valuable because nobody applauds them. A loyal spouse doesn't become less valuable because nobody notices every sacrifice. A hardworking employee doesn't become less valuable because their effort happens behind the scenes. Value doesn't disappear simply because recognition is absent. That's a lesson worth remembering, especially in a world that constantly encourages people to measure themselves through attention. Followers, views, status, visibility, those things come and go. Character stays, integrity stays. The ability to help other people stays. The ability to sleep peacefully at night stays. And eventually, those things matter far more. So if you've listened to this story and you see a piece of yourself in it, I want to leave you with one final thought. Keep doing the right thing. Keep building a life you're proud of. Keep treating people with dignity. Keep developing skills, character, and purpose. But don't turn your life into a campaign for approval. The people who truly matter won't need a public demonstration to recognize your worth. And the people who require one may never recognize it anyway. The moment you stop needing permission to value yourself is often the moment real peace begins. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every day we share stories about family, resilience, dignity, personal growth, and the lessons that help us navigate real life a little better. Join our community, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next story.